Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Unrest continues in the Xinjiang region of China between indigenous Uyghur Muslims and the Han Chinese. This week saw 2 Uyghur teens shot dead by police in the city of Kashgar and suicide bombings in a vegetable market in the city of Umtrai, resulting in 39 deaths. 55 people, mostly Uyghurs, were also sentenced in a public trial that was attended by 7,000 people in a stadium. Sentences were passed for a range of crimes that included terrorism, separatism and murder, with 3 death sentences being issued. A similar trial took place last week where 39 people were sentenced on very similar charges. Uyghurs complain of state discrimination in favour of the Han Chinese and of policies that undermine the Uyghurs' language, culture and the practice of their religion. China claims it's fighting terror and extremism after a series of attacks in cities across the country, but it's focused most of its efforts in the west and northwest, where a large indigenous Muslim Uyghur minority lives. China launched what it calls its own war on terror after the September 11 attacks, and now brands separatists as terrorists. China has also said that it considers Uyghur separatists as part of a network of Islamic extremism and accuses the separatists of receiving funding, training and support from Muslim countries. So, are the Uyghurs a threat to China? And what's behind the actions of the Chinese government? In the wake of the public mass sentencing, what is the future for the Uyghurs? Joining me in the studio to discuss these issues are Dr. Enver Tohti Bugda, an independent researcher and former president of the Uyghur Association UK, and Rod Wai, who's an associate fellow in the Asia programme at Chatham House in London. Welcome to you both. But before we start the discussion, let's take a look at this report.
Officials in the Chinese province of Xinjiang showed their support following a mass public trial held yesterday. Hosted in a sports stadium, thousands watched as 55 sentences were handed out to the province's Uyghur Muslims, along with a number of death sentences. According to state media, those censored were suspected of conspiring or carrying out acts of terror against the mainland Chinese population. Turbulence between the Uyghurs and the China mainland Han population is not a new phenomenon. While ethnic and religious tensions have always been evident, the past few years has seen more frequent clashes between the groups. In early March, an attack in Kunming train station resulted in the death of 29 people and were attributed to Uyghur separatists. The Uyghurs were also accused of other acts of violence, including an attempt to supposedly assassinate President Xi Jinping during his visit to Xinjiang. The spate of attacks has prompted the Chinese government to declare its own war on terror. It's authorized the arming of police officers and have granted them permission to kill if a threat is suspected. Presence of armed authorities has also been beefed up in China's major cities like Beijing and Sichuan, prompting some human rights activists to claim that the government is actively fostering a culture of fear. Meanwhile, Uyghurs continue to be vilified on a local level, particularly through social media websites like Weibo, with prominent commentators and bloggers calling the Uyghurs violent, dangerous and encouraging the Han population not to trust them. Sadly, such discrimination has become part of everyday life for the Uyghurs. According to Human Rights Watch, the government has long conducted a crushing campaign of religious repression against China's Muslims in the name of anti-separatism and counter-terrorism. The report also said that the government used America's post-9/11 war on terror as an opportunity to introduce laws prohibiting the freedom of worship and assembly for Muslims. As a result, Muslims have been prevented from leaving China to go on the Hajj pilgrimage, and they've been arrested and detained simply for watching Islamic lectures online or praying in public. Even in their homeland of Yanjing, there has been some reports of Uyghur Muslims being harassed by the authorities under the false pretense of being a threat to national security. Years of discrimination and abuse have resulted in a growing separatist movement in the Uyghur community, something that China is desperately trying to put down. For China, such dissident movements threaten its wider economic and foreign policy agenda. China's continued persecution of the Uyghurs and their failure to control the growing anger amongst Yanjing's youth may affect its desire of becoming the world's #1 economy, or even its ambition to become a global superpower. Hussein Kazvani, Islam Channel.
Okay, so Rod, I mean, this is a pretty dramatic series of events. Does it mark a ratcheting up of what the Chinese state is attempting to do, or is this kind of business as usual?
I don't think it's business as usual because it is a very unusual series of events, and I think the Chinese have been giving quite some thought to their policy towards Xinjiang recently. It was interesting that the Chinese Politburo met on Monday to discuss the Xinjiang issue, and the first reports that came out of that meeting were that they were going to take a sort of two-pronged approach. One was continue with their hard attack on terrorism. There's going to be a year's striking hard against terrorism in Xinjiang in particular. But there's also a sort of, they also decided on a softer approach where they had identified that many of those involved in the so-called terrorist incidents were of low educational status and often unemployed. So they were going to try to improve education in Xinjiang and improve employment prospects in Xinjiang. And then all these other things happened 2 or 3 days later. So whether that has any effect on this sort of more softly approach remains to be seen. But clearly, the previous approach of just striking hard wherever they saw terrorism or believed terrorist was happening is not working. And it's also interesting that they've recently announced that some 65, I think, Chinese officials have been disciplined for failing to deal toughly enough with terrorism. So there's something wrong within their own system. They recognize that. They need a new approach. But as soon as they seem to have thought about it, then a whole new series of events happened.
And what about these public trials? I mean, you know, there's a large number of defendants. One of these has taken place in front of 7,000 people in a stadium. Is this a ratcheting up? Or, I mean, we haven't heard of this for a while, have we?
Well, first of all, I would like to present my sadness to those relatives who got killed by the tragic events across China, not only in Xinjiang. Then the problem in China is that they're powerful abusing those powerless. And in Xinjiang, this is reflected in the treatment in the Uyghurs and the minority increasingly. And I believe just these things taking place. It can be said that because that's legitimate grievance and the social inequality.
Yeah, I was asking specifically about the mass trial in the stadium. Yeah. So do you want to just comment on that? Is this a ratcheting up of the level of sort of suppression?
I think because I would like to invite all of us to look at these things more widely.
Yeah. We'll come on to the wider aspects.
Yeah.
That will strike many people as an absolutely extraordinary event. And I'm asking you to comment on that and put it in some context.
Yes, I agree with that. This is a Chinese strategy, and I killed that chicken to scare monkey. And that is the strategy. I agree with that.
Rod, what about this? Is the public trials thing and the stadium? How unusual a departure is that?
It is a pretty unusual happening these days. I mean, it's sort of old-fashioned, if you like.
We're going back to the sort of days of the Cultural Revolution, aren't we?
Dealt with in China. Indeed it is. I mean, it's part of this education exercise, clearly, that they want to, as Enver was saying, demonstrate to the people of Xinjiang that the Chinese state authorities, security authorities, are extremely effective and will deal instantly with any kind of opposition.
How does that happen? Because I think people will be quite interested in the kind of mechanics of this. I mean, okay, we can understand what they do. They decide we're going to have it in a stadium. How do you get 7,000 people? I mean, this isn't you know, Tyburn Tree in the 18th century. You naturally gather a 7,000 strong crowd to see a trial.
You tell them to come.
So this is an enforced public spectacle. That's what we're saying, really.
It is, yes.
And so. What do you think? Let's try and unpick the truth of the terrorism charge here, because you know, since Bush and Blair began this rhetoric, there's practically not a government in the world that doesn't deem its opposition to be terrorist. The Egyptian government is playing this game. The Assad government is playing this game. The Russian government plays this game. So just because they say it, we can't assume it's true. So what is actually going on, and where are the attacks that are taking place, where are they coming from?
Well, they're coming from this deep-seated sense of grievance and frustration. Grievance that the Uyghur people feel that their customs, their social life is being undermined by the Chinese. Grievance that they are not enjoying the fruits of the prosperity that Xinjiang is enjoying at the moment, that most of the benefits of development go to the Han Chinese incomers rather than the local people. And frustration that they can't really do anything about it, that they can't effectively complain to the Chinese authorities, because once you do, then you're seen as a troublemaker and all the might of the state comes down upon you. If you don't, then what do you do? And it is left to some individuals that they feel that they're driven beyond frustration. And I think that is the prime cause of it. There's no substantive evidence of organisation, of real outside support, interference, anything like that.
So there's kind of elemental minority backlash, that's what you're saying.
It seems to be. It's still relatively unsophisticated, what happens. It doesn't bear the hallmarks of sort of outside training or all these kind of things. I'm no expert in terrorism, but the stories, the reports that you get are very sort of simple things. They're knife attacks, they're very simple homemade bombs, they're frustrated individuals attacking. Previously, it was sort of signs of the Chinese state, police stations and these kind of things. Now there is a new element, this much more indiscriminate use of violence against civilian, essentially, people, and that is very, very sad. And as Enver said, you know, a lot of innocent people get hurt in that.
And Enver, we said in the introduction, and you were saying in your first contribution, that these have not just been limited to the Uyghur areas. So what's going on when there have been attacks elsewhere?
If we look, zooming out, look at a little wider picture, we can see a different pictures, because look at that, the current president, Xi, is leading an enormous anti-corruption campaign. At the end of the campaign line, it is former President Jiang Zemin and his, there's another one, ousting leader called Zhou Yongkang. Because nowadays, if you look at China, you can see a relaxing sign of that, redefining that June 4th movement. And June 4th movement, it is coming on the 25th anniversary. And this is the bottom line of this the former President, Jiang Zemin. So, Mr. Xi's action, it is touching his bottom line. And Jiang and Zhou's, they underlings, they won't give up so easily. And then we see that so many things happen across China, like Kunming attacks, and that Urumqi train station attack. Because here is a significant mistake making by the Western media, is that they don't follow this story to the bottom. When that story broke up in China, the Chinese decided this is carried out by Uyghurs. Then Western media put this on the headline. After a few days, the Chinese media, they stopped saying that. Now they stopped linking that the Kunming attack as carried out by Uyghurs. They stopped saying that, but the Western media continues saying that.
So Rod, so who else, you know, I mean, you've described, you know, the conditions that are producing this kind of thing among the Uyghurs, but who else might be involved in these other attacks? And is it the same thing, a kind of backlash against sort of enforced development?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say give a straight answer to these kind of things. I mean, there is clearly a lot of violence in China, one way and another. One hears of a lot of attacks on school children, for instance. There are bombing attacks, knife attacks across China for all sorts of what seem to be essentially personal reasons, personal grievances against the world, the state, whatever it may be. So it's difficult for an outsider without sort of access to the information to know exactly who or what is behind any one incident.
So you're saying that perhaps some of the other attacks are perhaps more like some of the school attacks that we've seen in the United States, for instance. You know, it's a kind of, there's a dysfunctional side to the society rather than being politically motivated or having a political route, or a directly political route?
Of course, that depends on your definition of politics. But yes, the situation in China as a whole is qualitatively different from that in Xinjiang, because in Xinjiang it's a question of how a group of people, the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities, are treated by the Chinese government. And that is still with considerable suspicion. What they want from the minority peoples, as they call them, is for them to become essentially Han Chinese, to assimilate into Chinese society, to behave in a Chinese kind of way. And the people don't like doing that because it means changing their way of life, changing their religion, and it's really not acceptable. But for the Chinese, there isn't another way still. They have tried and continue to try economic development. And they say, you know, what we are giving to you is economic development, a better life. Why do you not want that? Why do you not accept that? But it comes with this insistence that minority peoples assimilate into the Chinese way of thinking and behaving.
Is this what we're seeing, Enver? Is this a sort of a kind of combination of economic development with a kind of nationalist, sort of chauvinistic sort of aspect to it, as these things are often combined?
To a large part of extent, I agree with Mr. White said that why the Chinese, they think that we are investing huge amount of money and you are not happy. And because if we look down to it, for example, there's a project carried out by the Chinese government and they investing a lot of money. The company who is taking that project is seeking that label from his home province. So this development project actually benefited those Chinese from inner China. There's nothing a benefit to the local Uyghurs apart from they are losing their land.
Right to be cheap labor.
Even they can't be cheap labor. Even that cheap labor, they can't get it. They are looking for cheap labor back home, back at the home province. And that is the Uyghur people not happy with.
So Rod, I mean, on that explanation, it's almost our colonial development, or is that pushing it too far?
It's not something the Chinese would like to be said,
but we'll park that thought, though.
there are clearly similarities to that. That this is still from the sort of indigenous peoples, if you like, of Xinjiang. It is incoming Chinese trying to dictate to them how they should run their lives, because the Chinese feel that they know better. They have, as it were, their equivalent of the white man's burden. They need to educate these rather backward people and bring them into the modern world. And from the Chinese perspective, when that happens, then of course all these problems will fall away, because they will have real loyalty to the new state and to the new life that they have been brought.
Muslims and Han Chinese. In this half of the programme, we'll be taking a look at how China manages to deal with its different ethnic groups within its borders, and also on issues to do with Tibet and Taiwan. China's role in the global war on terror will also be considered, and we'll be looking at China's rise and the possible challenge that it poses for the new world order. My guest from the first half are still with me, and joining us on the line is Professor Yongjin Zhang, who's a Professor of International Politics at the University of Bristol. Welcome to the show, Professor. Rod, we were concluding the discussion there by saying, comparing the situation as it's been in the past for the Uyghurs, but how does the Chinese state manage its other relations with other ethnic groups, and how different is the situation of the Uyghurs?
It has its own peculiar special characteristics. The closest parallel is, as you mentioned, Tibet, where the behavior of the Chinese state is in many ways very similar to the way that it behaves in Xinjiang. But of course the cultural background of the Tibetans is very different from that of the Muslims in Xinjiang. So the circumstances are not entirely the same. Elsewhere in China there are, I forget how many it is, 50 55 or so national minorities that they have identified. Very few of those does one see the same kind of tensions that one sees with Tibet and Xinjiang. Mostly they are sort of semi-assimilated into Chinese practice, find no real problems in living side by side with Han Chinese, and it doesn't affect their lives hugely. So I think the sort of policies that the Chinese government adopts towards minorities are in a sense directed towards the other 53, if you like, or not quite that number, because there are other minorities, Muslim minorities in Xinjiang who suffer in the same way as the Uyghurs. And they really can't understand why these peoples in Tibet and in Xinjiang just don't get the message.
Professor Zhang, welcome to the programme. Is what we're looking at here the process of sort of reinforcing or reconstituting a unitary state in the process of reindustrialisation? I mean, we're familiar from the history of Britain of the way in which that state was created by very different policies in Scotland, in Wales, in Ireland. Are we seeing a kind of similar 21st century version of that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you know, it's the peculiar feature, I think, of the. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I think the peculiar feature of China as a multi-ethnic kind of nation state was created, as we know, when the Qin Empire was replaced by the Republic of China, and Xinjiang and Tibet became part of that new republic. The Chinese Empire collapsed, but the empire didn't disintegrate. So that is one of the historical problems that modern China has to deal with. I mean, after the Republic of China, obviously, then there was an issue of territorial integrity in terms of the more modern nation state of China. So there is no reconstitute of the state happening in China today. I think the previous speaker talked about how Chinese government deals with a number of other ethnic groups or minorities within the Chinese border. And that is the approach that has been taken for many years. Now, one thing I should emphasize is perhaps that we cannot just generalize that Uyghurs or Tibetans as a unified group, as if everyone in Tibet and Xinjiang has serious complaints against the Chinese government. Again, within this population, there are groups of people who have more probably economic, political, and social grievances against either the Chinese government in Beijing or local government. So we have to differentiate that. So the demand for redressing those grievances obviously is there, but how much is that has that to do with the demand for independence, for example, in Tibet, or the so-called separatism in Xinjiang is a question that we need to look at.
Okay. Well, let me ask Enver about that. I mean, to what degree, I guess what the professor's suggesting is that, that the discontent is not necessarily universally shared, and we would expect that to be the case. But how widespread and how deep is it?
Well, this is as a Uyghur myself, and I would see that kind of stuff is just quite irrelevant to the real problem in that land. Because Uyghur, they are becoming stranger in their own homeland, and the Chinese media, as controlled by the Chinese government, is directing these people's attention and try to create a conflict between Han and Uyghur nations, and try to focus and alter people's focus to somewhere else rather than their own political ruling crisis. So, I think that the real issue here is not addressed.
Rod, how would you respond to the point that the professor made? How widespread and how deep is this? Or I'm sure the government would say it's a minority of troublemakers. But
well, of course, he's right that not everybody sees things in the same way, and that in a programme like this we're forced to generalise. And I think it is true that there is widespread, and I can't really put numbers on that, discontent in both Xinjiang and Tibet with what is happening and what is happening to the people. But that said, I think he does make a really valid point about the Chinese state and how it views this situation. The continuation of the Chinese state from the Chinese Empire, the Chinese Republic, and now the People's Republic, and this insistence on territorial integrity and indivisibility of China. And what it really fears most is splitting off. And thus you get this endless rhetoric, particularly in Tibet, about how the Tibetans are seeking independence, which is simply not true. The Dalai Lama has given that up as a political goal. In Xinjiang it is less clear-cut because there isn't that same kind of clear political leadership, if you like. But I don't think the demands of the people in Xinjiang are about independence. They're about being able to run their own lives and live their own lives in the way that they would like to. And be happy to be part of a Chinese state if that is the case.
Professor Zhang, we're just coming up to a break, but do you think that in demonising this current of opinion as separatism when perhaps it isn't, the Chinese state will create what it most fears, but which doesn't exist at the moment?
Well, I mean, this is a very debatable point, whether there is a separatist movement or not in Xinjiang. I mean, if you read various reports, even those who are outside China are actually saying that the Xinjiang and Tibet has been suffering from the Chinese colonization for centuries. So if that is the case, obviously those people who actually accuse the Chinese colonization obviously understand Tibet or Xinjiang as a separate nation. Otherwise, they wouldn't use the colonization as the description of China's control of those territories.
Okay, Professor, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to stop you there. We will come back to you after the break, but we've just got to take a short break now, and we'll be continuing the discussion very shortly. Do rejoin us. Well, just before the break, I was talking to our Skype guest, Professor Zhang, about the degree of separatism or not in the Xinjiang province. Professor, sorry to have cut you off there, but let's return to that point. I think you were saying that there are people really now who are arguing this is essentially a colonial process, and therefore there may be a separatist dynamic at work here.
I think that is the case. So it's very difficult to actually argue if that kind of language is used, there is no demand for independence or statehood.
Okay, Rod, what do you reckon there? Is this simply a language that people use when they're under pressure, or is there a genuine momentum? And if there isn't, could there become one?
I think, to start at the end, I think there could become one. And I think part of what we have seen, particularly in Xinjiang, is the Chinese miscalculating their policies and bringing about exactly those circumstances that they feared most would happen. And therefore, I think there is a chance that some kind of real separatist political movement could develop. At the moment, though, we have to look at the realities of life. And the realities of life are that the Chinese state is strong enough and determined enough to prevent any kind of independence in either Xinjiang or Tibet. And most people have to accept that and live within those parameters. So I think that the numbers who, even if you talk about colonialism and extrapolate from that if you talk about colonialism, then you want freedom and therefore you want independence. The numbers who are actually active in any form are very, very small. So I don't think there is any coherent political movement within Xinjiang towards a free Turkestan or whatever.
And there are a variety of political forms that can go along with that rhetoric. I mean, if we think about the Basque country, for instance, it's not going to become the Basque independent state, even though that kind of rhetoric is fully in use in in that case. Enver, do you think that's where we are, that people are expressing themselves in these terms, but that they're not necessarily at this point headed for, or indeed have the kind of political movement which could seriously put on the table the issue of a separate state?
This I should remind that professor that Xinjiang was occupied not by the China, nowadays China. It was Manchurian dynasty. And it doesn't mean that you are inheriting whole Manchurian territory. The Qing dynasty is different with that Chinese empire. And secondly, I would argue that there wasn't any movement seeking independence from China from that beginning to now. And what is happening is all this independent movement in these words, we are learning from Chinese media. We didn't create this. We are learning from Chinese media. And it is clear that we can see that before that Orange riot, there are many people, they are sitting in the street and drinking beer. But after that, they try to distinguish themselves from Han Chinese. They start going to the mosque. So there is a trend that they are putting so much pressure to create what they want, so-called independence movement or separatism or terrorism.
So, Professor Zhang, let me get your response to that, because, I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that this has happened. I mean, there's certainly one take on the Irish Troubles, which says that, you know, at the beginning of the current phase of the Troubles, the IRA were a bunch of old blokes sitting around in pubs discussing the Civil War, and it was the suppression of the civil rights movement which rebuilt it as an armed struggle. Is there no element of that where you think that the state is producing the thing that it doesn't want?
I think I tend to agree with the two previous speakers. I mean, about the existence of independence movement within Xinjiang. Certainly, we have no credible evidence of a movement, apart from probably a few people who actually probably had the idea. But the IRA experience is an interesting comparison, not in terms of state creating its own enemy, but really we are talking about whether the issue here are a number of grievances that not only the Uyghur people has, but also other minority people might have in Xinjiang and Tibet, and the violence that we have witnessed in Xinjiang or other places in China, including Tibet. So there are separate issues here that we are dealing with. Obviously, I think even the Chinese government has recently moved to sort of address or try to address, at least in some measure, those grievances of the minority people in those places. So certainly not just in Tibet and Xinjiang. And so we are dealing with different issues here. I think we have to be very clear. On the one hand, is to deal with political, economic, religious grievances. On the other hand, is to deal with this kind of terrorism or violence that we have seen.
Okay, Rod, let's sort of look at the sort of global, or try and fit this into a global picture, because, you know, as I said before, not unusual for a modern state to be using the language of a war on terror. In some cases, that is used at least partially to try and ingratiate the state in question with the originators of this language in the West. So El-Sisi and Assad will use this language to say, well, you know, basically to the West, really, you should be on our side because we're doing the same thing that you're doing. But presumably, it doesn't have that external dimension where the Chinese are concerned.
I don't think it does. I mean, the Chinese were actually quite quick to support the US after 9/11, and you know, a lot of this emphasis on terrorism, as you mentioned, has sort of developed since then, and it is very difficult now to ascertain exactly what anyone means at any one time by terrorism. But I think for China, this is part of, I mean, what is part of this new drive by Xi Jinping to speak of the Chinese dream. The Chinese dream of China standing proud in the world. And what it does not want, as part of that process, is to feel that in its own backyard there are people bent on disturbing, upsetting that China dream of projecting a strong, united China to the world.
Mm. So Enver, I mean, do you think that is there any sense in which this is working for the Chinese in an international sphere? I mean, perhaps they may not be interested in currying favour with the West in the same way that maybe Assad or Syria are, but perhaps they're saying, don't get on our backs about human rights because you're doing this, we're doing this. What's the problem?
This issue, what was happening here is that the Chinese made a deal with the United States saying that we have terrorists at our backyard. And this wasn't true. This is something like there isn't any such movement. They created it, for example, the Turkestan Islamic movement. This book, and even there's a book published, and this is based on the artificial document provided by the Chinese government. Even Chinese themselves, there was one professor, his job was listening that foreign radio before September 11. And he said that before that, he has never ever heard that word called East Turkestan Islamic Movement. This is actually a ghost organization. Mm. And here, what's going on with that Mr. Xi's campaign and that his opponent, that they need a battleground. And the Uyghurs, it's become the perfect candidate for that as a scapegoat.
Yeah. So, Professor Zhang, do you think that's what's happening? You know, that there's a kind of off-the-shelf, ready-made rhetoric here about terrorism and Islamic extremism, which the Chinese state are using because, hey, why be left out? Everybody else is.
No, I tend to ask the other two speakers a very simple question. If your state has witnessed the kind of terror attacks recently in Xinjiang and Urumqi, what would you like your state to react? Would you like your state to sit by, just to say, okay, that's just an attack, so be it, so we don't do anything about it, or would you like your state to react and really try to deal with this terrorism? Terror attacks to make safe everybody else safe. That's a basic question. I think we have to acknowledge the legitimacy of Chinese response to terror attacks. Don't confuse the issue here. Confuse a particular response to terror attack with a more broader kind of approach to Xinjiang and Tibet. So I think that's very, very important.
Well, let me just sort of address that question, seeing you raise it. I mean, I guess most people in this country, after say the 7/7 attacks, were divided in their opinion. Some said, "Yeah, I want my state to whack those people, get on and whack them," and some people said, "Look, I think you need to understand the cause of this." So maybe there's more than one answer to the question you're posing.
I think you're absolutely right. That's why I think, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at how the Chinese government approaches this, at least in rhetoric, there are two thrusts. One is really deal with criminality of the activities. The other is really try to address, as much as I think they can or they acknowledge, the grievances I mentioned before, political, economic, and religious. So I think that's probably the right approach. I don't think they're going to sort of just strike a big blow and then go away. They know they have to deal with this in the long term, and this is a long-term problem. It's not a short-term one.
Okay. So, Rod, you were saying at the beginning there's a kind of twin-track approach here. Where's the balance lying at the moment? Are they doing more sticking or are they doing more carroting?
I think it is inevitable and understandable, as Professor Zhang says, that when you have these kind of appalling incidents, as happened with the Urumqi bombing, it is the duty of the state to protect its citizens and to make sure that those who perpetrated that particular act are brought to justice and to do their best to prevent other such acts. But there are all sorts of ways of achieving those goals. You don't have to have mass trials of suspects. You don't have to have draconian new laws introduced. There are ways of doing it. And I think the Chinese had, as I said before, recognized that there is a need for a dual approach, that it isn't all about striking hard. Striking hard is effective but limited. What you need is to deal with the root causes, and the Chinese, to their credit, are looking at some of those root causes. But they tend to look at it very much in economic terms. It's about the economic well-being of the groups or the place concerned. What they tend to find it difficult to come to terms with are the social and cultural and religious aspects of it.
I mean, this is a long story, isn't it? You know, if we build a business park on your village, why aren't you grateful? Kind of approach. I mean, it very rarely does the trick, does it?
It doesn't, but it does to some extent, because it does help, the economic development of the region, and it helps bring people out of poverty. And these are laudable goals, and the Chinese have had, considerable success.
And do you think that's happening? I mean, you were casting some doubt on that earlier. You were saying, it might be one thing if there was low-paid jobs, but we aren't even getting the low-paid jobs. So is that economic development, is it, to use the phrase, trickling down as far as the Uyghurs, or not?
That is try to cheat that international community, saying that we are doing as much we can to tackle these problems, and to just speakers, theoretically, I 100% agree what he said, and what is this? I disagree with that the bombing in Xinjiang. There's another one in the September 8th, 2000. That time was that Chinese Prime Minister visiting Urumqi, Zhu Rongji visiting Urumqi. He disagreed with that local governor, saying that Xinjiang is a very dangerous place. He said, "Oh, I didn't find this dangerous." Then 2 days later, there's a military vehicle exploded in the middle of the city, killing 60 people and 300 wounded. And another one is last month. But here, if we say that they carried out by Uyghur attacking Chinese, I would expect that this is just going to happen in the significant days, like Chinese New Year or Muslim festivals. No, they didn't. It's only coinciding with that major political event in Beijing.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave this discussion, because we've come to the end of this episode of Analysis. To thank my guests in the studio and, of course, you at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions, and don't forget, you can keep up with our discussions if you follow us on Twitter at the address below, or by following the Islam Channel Current Affairs team on Facebook. So, till next time, good night.